While the Persian Gulf's gas-rich Abu Dhabi made peace with Israel last week, Gazans in Palestine have been bombed every day for the last 10 days. West Asia woke up to the announcement of a controversial peace agreement between the UAE and Israel a week ago as the residents of the Gaza Strip, which is the only enclave not under Israeli occupation, woke up to another day with bombs coming from Israel. The announcement of an agreement to normalize relations between the UAE and the Israeli occupation regime was not surprising, but was rude in terms of form and timing. Everyone who follows news of normalization in recent years notices it is no secret the Persian Gulf Arab states, especially the Emirates, is persistent and stubborn to break old taboos, which Arabs believed in for decades in their relationship to the Palestinian cause. UAE rulers have made efforts to market and integrate the Israeli occupation regime in the region, even at the expense of the security of its region and the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people, with flimsy pretexts such as confronting the central enemy of the Arabs, Iran, although the UAE maintains strong and rooted relations with Iran, especially at the economic level, which it cannot afford to lose. The strange thing about this agreement is that the UAE rulers justify their heinous act of betrayal by claiming that this agreement was made in exchange for the occupation state's postponement of annexing lands in the West Bank for an indefinite period. This is exactly what Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister of the occupation regime, denied in his press conference last week and affirmed the annexation was not dismissed but was temporarily suspended. Normalization with the enemy is not merely a political endeavor. It is rather a denial of all national and humanitarian obligations towards the fairest issue in modern history, the Palestinian cause. The UAE has simply betrayed Palestine. Welcome to the Mideastream. I'm Marwa Osman. The United Arab Emirates agreement to normalize ties with Israel is being deemed by Palestinians as the gravest betrayal of the struggle of Palestinian liberation and self-determination. The condemnation echoes the strength of feeling across Palestinian society and the Arab world, with much disgust being expressed on social media and among Arab scholars and academics who had interacted inside the UAE. To discuss this issue with us from Beirut is Dr. Abdelhadi Al-Ajli, academic and researcher. Thank you very much for being with us, Dr. Abdelhadi. Now, the world is really not in shock by the UAE's betrayal of the Palestinian cause by inking this so-called peace agreement with Israel. However, coming out like this only opens doors to more Arab states to do exactly the same. What do you think will which actually state do you think will be next to betray Palestine?
First of all, thank you for having me. And second, I wouldn't call it betrayal, because the word betrayal itself, it gives the assumption that the Emirates have had an active role in the struggle beside the Palestinians or against Israel, or have a deep solidarity. So I'm very skeptical using the word betrayal. But having said that, and having seen the path that the United Arab Emirates have taken in the last few years, we know for the fact that the Emirates have been normalizing sport normalization, intellectual normalization, even space normalization in terms of allowing Israeli jets, for example, or even allowing Israeli citizens to have a transit in the Abu Dhabi and Dubai. I think we would have either one Bahrain, one thing, or Oman, which Oman has a long history of normalization with Israel. But it seems that the Bahrain is on the top list of these. Of course, we wouldn't rule Sudan, a new regime, and his appetite to normalize with Israel, as well as the Yemeni government, which is a pro-Emirate government, which has showed some positive signals towards normalization with Israel. But let me stress that Israel is usually normalized with authoritarian and autocratic regimes. So if we look at who are the states that normalize with Israel, I mean states that's not in the surrounding historic Palestine, we would say that the Emirates, I mean, we have high level of authoritarianism there. They are, of course, they have high quality of life, but they don't have freedom of speech. I mean, the only way that the Emirati could express, for example, their opinion is to stay silent, as many Western journalists have witnessed in the Emirate, as well as online by just writing emojis and not a single word. So to sum this, I think that we will witness a country that have been normalizing with Israel in sport normalization, political normalization, and such as Bahrain. I mean, we need to measure what the Emirates did, and then we will find out who is the next.
Well, from what you said, the UAE regime claims that their move will help move the so-called peace process in the region further. How? What peace process are they talking about? What about the Judaization of Al-Quds? What about the annexation of the West Bank? What about the continuous bombardment of Gaza? I mean, this hasn't even stopped even while the so-called peace process was being inked with the UAE regime. What are they talking about?
Well, I mean, this is usually the rhetoric of Arab regimes that try to hijack the Palestinian struggle. Well, what peace process in general? We don't have a peace process. I mean, the peace process, which has started with the Oslo Accord, is dead long time ago, even before Arafat died in 2004. So what I see here is that the Emirates tried to legitimize their move of normalization by claiming that this will develop the life of the Palestinians, that will stop the annexation. Indeed, the annexation stopped 2 months ago. I mean, before even the announcement of Netanyahu that the annexation has been put in hold.
But that had more to do with the protests against Netanyahu than anything else.
Not really like this, because with the dynamics of international relations, the dynamics in Europe, the sensation of annexation in Europe wasn't very positive. So the game was not only internal. Actually, Netanyahu would have done that if he didn't witness high level of opposition from the world, especially from the European Union, from Russia, and from other countries in the world, especially in Egypt and in Jordan, because the move to annexation would have ended the two-state solution, which already ended, but politically, I mean, internationally. So the United Arab Emirates claim that they stopped the annexation was actually falsified just a few hours after the Trump announcement by the Netanyahu himself, and he said that the annexation is going to happen, but it's a matter of time. So I don't know what kind of attempt that the Emirates have tried to do, which I would call it, as Rashid Khaldi said it, that it's the Emirati normalization agreement with Israel is just a continuation of the 100 years of war against the Palestinians.
This puts it at what most of the Arab leaders have been doing throughout the 20th century, and the ruling families as well, which you mentioned are mostly authoritarian. They maintained cordial relations with Israel, and before it, the Zionist movement as well, which is also the excuse used by most pro-Zionist Arab quote-unquote intellectuals who call for open ties with Israel. What will these new governments really change in the Arab, these new agreements, I mean, will change in the Arab world if they actually go into action and we start seeing Israeli colonial settlers just roaming around Arab capitals?
Well, I mean, this is a very good question. What did it change? Of course, many intellectuals and many writers and analysts have said that it will not change anything. Well, I see it from a different point of view. Mm-hmm. It will have a very, very negative impact on the lives of the Arab population. This agreement is an initiation of the split of the Arab world into two classes. Mm-hmm. Here I'm talking about the socio-economic classes, socio-political classes. This agreement wanted who are pro-normalization, pro-Israel, pro-autocrats and figures like in monarchies who live in a protectorates in new cities like Neom in Saudi Arabia, or even in Dubai, some parts of Dubai and Abu Dhabi, and even in New Cairo, somehow to live as a class that's privileged with all means to make their lifestyle as Hassan Khader called it Gulfanization from the meaning of people who live in the Gulf who are privileged. And this put us also, what the Israeli member of the Knesset, the Zionist member of the Knesset, Eli Avidar, who said that who are against this agreement are usually envious of the lifestyle of those who are pro-normalization with Israel, mm-hmm. which means here.
Dr. Abdelhadi, we just have less than a minute left for this segment, and I really want to know, I'm interested to see how this will reflect the implementation of the so-called deal of the century inside Palestine, especially inside Gaza and the West Bank. How do you see that happening?
Well, I mean, the deal of the century has been implemented for a long time. The annexation didn't stop, building settlements didn't stop. The efforts to keep the Palestinians fragmented in Gaza Strip and the West Bank has been intensified in recent months. I think it's not about the deal of the century. The deal of the century has been implemented for a long time, and it's a plan has never been stopped. I think this issue of how it will affect the lives of the Palestinians, it's more suffering, more thief of the Palestinian land, more Judaization of Jerusalem under the eyes of the Arab regimes. And this is the most important part of this is that what we need is an Arab front from the people, and I'm not talking here about political front, but the population front, social front, to combat this kind of normalization that will keep poor people more poor and jeopardize the lives of millions of hundreds of millions of Arab people.
I want to thank you very much, Dr. Abdelhadi Al-Ajli, academic and researcher, for joining us. I enjoyed this despite the fact that it was really a negative form of dealing with the Palestinian plight. But I would like to have you on again, maybe to talk for both segments about how this will affect politically, economically, and socially as well within Palestine and the region. I want to thank you very much for joining us, and please stay tuned next for the second segment in the Mideastream. It is not possible to understand the verdict of the International Tribunal for Lebanon without returning to the full path that it went through over the past years. The path proved that the court was highly politicized, and the verdict of the hearing session confirmed this, for the most part presented just as a political analysis of the process of the Lebanese events just before 2005. Special Tribunal for Lebanon failure in this following report. A UN-backed special tribunal gave a verdict in The Hague after the trial in absentia of 4 alleged members of Hezbollah accused of being behind a massive truck bomb attack 15 years ago, assassinating the former Lebanese Prime Minister Rafiq al-Hariri. However, the Special Tribunal for Lebanon failed to provide evidence for its claims, acquitting those accused except one, Salim Ayyash, who the court says, quote, is affiliated to Hezbollah, end quote, without even telling us how. The judgment was initially scheduled to be delivered in May, but was delayed twice. First, due to the coronavirus pandemic, and second, as a gesture of solidarity for the victims of the massive explosion in Beirut on August 4th, which devastated the city. It is not possible to understand the verdict of the International Tribunal for Lebanon without returning to the full path that it went through over the past years, and before that, the process that the international investigation commissions have gone through. The two paths showed the fact that the court was highly politicized, and the verdict of the hearing session confirmed this. For the most part, it presented just a political analysis of the process of the Lebanese events before 2005. The court reached certain conclusions underlying that Hezbollah and the Syrian state had an interest in the assassination of Hariri. However, the court failed to provide evidence for its claims. Consequently, what the court reached in the end may be aimed at defending its objectivity while it presented what was previously known, but in a softer way. However, the most asked question in Lebanon today is how will Hezbollah react to this verdict? A few years ago, Hezbollah announced that it was dealing with the International Tribunal on the basis that it did not exist, after it was turned into a political tool in the hands of the United States of America and Israel, in addition to other international and regional powers. Therefore, it seems Hezbollah will simply not have any reaction to the verdict issued by the court. However, its silence is an affirmation of its previous position on it, which means that it does not recognize the court nor its verdict. To discuss this issue with us from Beirut is Ms. Gina Shammas, political commentator. Thank you very much for being with us, Ms. Gina. Now, from the first day of the Hariri assassination, we had the March 14th alliance seeking to exploit this assassination through a political accusation against Syria at the beginning and then against Hezbollah later on. The verdict came out acquitting Hezbollah and Syria, saying there is no evidence of their involvement last week. How do you describe the course of this trial and the verdict that it has reached after 15 years of the assassination?
Hello, Marwa. Hello for everybody listening and watching. The court, the tribunal, is a special tribunal. It's the result of an agreement, a contract that was signed with the two parties. Lebanon, as a country, is one of the parties. According to statements made by the Minister of Justice, Rizq, this agreement includes in it that there will not be an accusation except for the specific people who actually committed the crime, and that the accusations will not be like in a political party or a country or something like that, but specifically the people who were caught and there's evidence that they are the ones who committed such crime. And therefore, the tribunal's results are consistent with the agreement made for this special tribunal. Now, from a political point of view, it is normal that since the situation between the late Prime Minister Hariri and Syria were in very bad shape, and there were several arguments and problems that occurred immediately before the assassination, it is normal for the people who lost their beloved father or the people who believed in Prime Minister Hariri that they would consider that Syria is responsible politically. And at a later stage, when they started thinking and there was more evidence looking like it was not necessarily Syria by itself, they turned to Hezbollah because they are armed and they have the ability to conduct activities that require arms or special planning, like the assassination.
Well, Ms. Gina, a few years ago, Hezbollah announced that it was dealing with the International Tribunal on the basis that it did not even exist. After it was turned into a political tool in the hands, especially in the hands of the rivals of Hezbollah, we're talking mainly about the USA and Israel, of course, in addition to other international and regional powers. But this is a court of law. why wasn't Israel one of the accused parties, since just before the assassination, Hariri was actually on great terms with the resistance and with Hezbollah? And you said he was maybe on a certain problem with Syria. He was obviously having problems as well with Israel being an enemy. Why wasn't Israel really included in this, maybe as an evidence or as a main accused behind this assassination?
The court can only look at the evidence that you present in front of the tribunal. And that's how they come up with the answers or with the judgment. It is a big mistake, I believe, that Hezbollah did not take on the court and defend properly whoever it is that is being accused, that they believe is not the party who committed the crime, and introduce evidence about Israel and others through the tribunal. One of the things that happened, I recall that Hezbollah at one point put on television a film that they put together about how they believe. So if you put the evidence and they look at it and they don't see that you have sufficient evidence to go after a person, just like the agreement says, because they cannot go after Israel, they have to go after a person.
Speaking about the evidences, which is very important in such a trial that's taking place, a lot of evidence was overlooked, was not looked upon by this court, like the security cameras in and around Ground Zero, especially that they were banks and companies, which means they could easily have access to these cameras, and the involvement of also Rafiq Hariri's head of security at that time, Wissam al-Hassan, who went MIA on that day with no evidence of his whereabouts. He said he was maybe attending an exam at the university that was not correct. He said that his phone was shut off, and again with investigations that was also not correct. And then he was himself assassinated in 2012. Yes. Who benefits from hiding all these facts?
Well, obviously the guilty would like to make sure that the court doesn't have sufficient evidence to come up with a proper judgment. Again, I believe that before the tribunal itself started, there was an investigative committee, and they were doing all this work. The fact that many parties in this country did not understand that since this became a reality, they had to deal with it, and they had to be engaged, and they had to put all the proper evidence, that made it where this became a weakness in the tribunal's ability to consider all the evidence. So being engaged was missing. First, they went after the 4 people in Lebanon. They put them in jail, and then there was absolutely no evidence against them, at least not in the judgment. There were also allegations that somebody tampered with evidence, but nobody proved that. So there was a lot of negligence to the scene and the proper evidence gathering and the proper presenting and preparing the evidence in a way that forces the tribunal to take them into consideration. We are not used to that in Lebanon. We have these problems. We believe that the tribunal does everything. They don't. We have to present our case. We have to put together the evidence. We have to defeat other evidence and explain it if it's presented from another party, if we believe it is not the appropriate evidence or it will not lead to the appropriate judgment or to the truth. One party was trying to do its best in defending their right and going after the guilty person who committed a big crime for Lebanon, and the other parties decided not to be engaged in that, which is not necessarily a good thing to do. Everyone in Lebanon should have been engaged properly to gather and collect all the evidence that would lead to the conviction of the right people who should have been convicted.
Ms. Jinad, this gets at to what former Prime Minister Saad al-Hariri, Rafiq Hariri's son and political heir, said when he attended the session, and where he said afterwards that he accepted the verdict and he wanted justice to be served. How do you think Hariri will bring this Salim Ayyash, who's supposedly one man who did everything, and that's just not logical, the man who is nowhere to be found, and yet who was announced by the sole man charged for committing this assassination, to justice? How is he going to bring him to justice?
Well, again, there is an agreement with the government of Lebanon. So it is not the responsibility of Prime Minister Saad al-Hariri to bring this man to justice. It is the duty of the Lebanese government to do so. And it is the duty of everyone who is responsible or in a position to help with that to make sure that such a thing happens. And therefore, everyone should be engaged to present this person to court so that the judgment can take place. Also, if there are any new evidence or if they want to rebuttal the judgment, there are ways to do that. But the responsibility of, once you have a court order, the responsibility is on the person who is to the contract, who signed the contract, which is the government of Lebanon, to make sure that justice prevails.
Thank you very much, Ms. Gina Shammas, political commentator, for joining us to talk about the special tribunal for Lebanon and the verdict they issued last week. Thank you very much for your contribution, and please stay tuned next week for more from the Mideastream.